She entered the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal in 1963 with depression and chronic fatigue. She was 26 years old, a mother of 5. Less than 3 months later, she could not remember her children's names. She could not read. She could not feed herself. When her husband came to bring her home, she did not recognize him. The doctor who treated her had led the American Psychiatric Association. The hospital was part of McGill University, and the program that funded her treatment was paid for by the Central Intelligence Agency. This did not end with the Cold War. In 2025, victims and their families were still in court, still trying to force accountability for what happened inside that hospital. Many of the original patients are dead. Their children are filing now. And one detail made this case different from almost every other institutional abuse file I had seen. The records did not simply disappear over time. They were deliberately destroyed, on command, before investigators could reach them. Before I go further, MKUltra has been buried under decades of mythology. Popular culture turns it into a story about perfect mind control, programmable assassins, sleeper agents activated by code words, the Unabomber as a CIA product. The declassified record shows something more disturbing. Not a successful machine for controlling people, a failed one. They tried to break human beings apart and rebuild them from zero. They used real patients as raw material. What they left behind was not an army of operatives. It was a trail of ruined lives. And for all the damage it caused, there is no documented evidence that it achieved the control it was chasing. The myth makes MKUltra sound frighteningly competent. The documented reality is frighteningly incompetent, and far worse for the people inside it. The program was authorized on April 13, 1953, by CIA Director Allen Dulles. It was administered by Sidney Gottlieb, a Caltech-trained chemist who ran the technical services staff. By 1963, even the CIA's own Inspector General was documenting the scale internally. 149 subprojects across roughly 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, prisons, places people trusted with their lives. But the name you need to know is Donald Ewen Cameron. Cameron was not a marginal figure. He was the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association. He had served as president of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. In 1945, he had been selected to evaluate Rudolf Hess at Nuremberg, to determine whether a man accused of crimes against humanity was fit to stand trial. A decade later, he was conducting experiments on civilians that his own patients' families would one day compare to what Nuremberg was built to prosecute. This was not a rogue doctor operating in the shadows. This was the face of institutional psychiatry. And this is the part that sounds invented, but is in Cameron's own published work. His method was called depatterning. The concept, as he described it in a 1962 paper published in Comprehensive Psychiatry, erase the patient's existing personality, memories, and behavioral patterns, then rebuild from zero. Those are his words, in a peer-reviewed journal. These were not enemy agents captured in black sites. They were ordinary psychiatric patients who had walked into a respected hospital asking for help. The protocol, documented in Cameron's publications and confirmed in the 1977 Senate hearing testimony, electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 75 times the standard intensity. Standard practice at the time called for a single session at controlled voltage for a fraction of a second. Cameron administered up to 6 sessions per day, for weeks. Drug-induced continuous sleep. Patients were kept unconscious using barbiturates, chlorpromazine, and other heavy sedatives for 15 to 86 consecutive days. Not resting, not sedated, unconscious. LSD, administered without the patient's knowledge or consent. And the most disturbing element was not the electroshock. It was what came after. Psychic driving. Recorded messages, sometimes the patient's own confessions, sometimes Cameron's voice, played on a continuous loop through speakers under the pillow or through headphones. Up to 500,000 repetitions, while the patient lay in a chemical coma, unable to remove the device. Cameron published this methodology. He described it as therapeutic. No documented professional outcry followed. One name is on the record more completely than most. Her case was documented by journalist Anne Collins in the 1988 book In the Sleep Room and entered into the Canadian government's compensation proceedings. She entered Cameron's program at 26, 5 children at home. Her complaint? Chronic fatigue and feeling low. That was it. She had signed consent for treatment, not for what they actually did. 102 days of drug-induced continuous sleep. 109 electroconvulsive treatments. Massive doses of thorazine and barbiturates. Taped messages on a loop while she was unconscious. Sensory deprivation. When it was over, Linda McDonald did not know who she was. She did not recognize her husband. She did not recognize her 5 children. She could not read. She could not drive. She could not cook. She had to be toilet trained. The damage was so severe that she lost recognition of her family, basic functional abilities, and the autobiographical continuity that had defined her entire life up to that point. She was never told the program was funded by the CIA. She was never told she was part of an experiment. Her file identified her as a psychiatric patient at a McGill-affiliated teaching hospital. That is what she signed for. Linda McDonald spent years relearning basic functions. How to hold a spoon, how to read a page, how to recognize the faces of the children she had raised. Her husband stayed. He helped reconstruct their life together from photographs, routines, and stories she could not remember living. In 1992, she was one of 77 victims who received $100,000 each from the Canadian government. $100,000 for a stolen life. The compensation came, and it answered almost nothing. Even after internal warnings, no one stopped it. The CIA's own Inspector General flagged the program in 1963, a full decade before it ended. The report, partially declassified in 1975, and later cited in the Church Committee hearings, catalogued 149 subprojects. It identified what should have shut the program down immediately. No informed consent, direct risk to human subjects, and a compartmentalized structure that made meaningful oversight impossible. The Inspector General recommended tighter controls. The program continued for 10 more years. And then the CIA tried to erase the paper trail. They almost succeeded. In January 1973, outgoing director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. The order was carried out. Operational files, research data, internal correspondence, destroyed. 2 years later, the Church Committee opened its investigation into intelligence abuses. Senators requested MKUltra documentation. The CIA's response? The records had been destroyed. But financial records had survived. Not because anyone preserved them, because they had been misfiled. Stored in a budget office rather than the operational archive. A clerical error. Boxes in the wrong building. Former State Department analyst John Marks obtained these records through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. Those misfiled documents, approximately 20,000 pages, showed where the money went. Grants to universities, hospitals, and individual researchers. Not the experiments themselves. The financial skeleton that made the experiments possible. Those records became the foundation for the hearings, the lawsuits, and much of the documentary record that survived. Without that clerical error, much of the testimony, the surviving patient record, and the documented proof of 149 subprojects might never have become documentable at all. The program would have existed only as rumor, real in memory, unprovable in court. 20,000 pages in the wrong office. That is the margin between documented history and permanent silence. Put the sequence together. 1953, MKUltra is authorized. That same year, CIA scientist Frank Olson is dosed with LSD without his knowledge at a retreat in rural Maryland. 9 days later, he falls to his death from a New York hotel window. A 1994 forensic exhumation finds cranial injuries inconsistent with a fall. The case is never officially resolved. 1957. Cameron begins Subproject 68 at McGill. 1962. He publishes depatterning under his own name in a psychiatric journal. No professional outcry follows. 1963. The CIA's own Inspector General raises concerns about consent and human risk. Nothing stops. 1973. Richard Helms orders the files destroyed. 1977. A clerical mistake exposes the financial paper trail. Gottlieb testifies. He remembers almost nothing. 1980. Canadian patients sue. One of them is Velma Orlico, who had gone to Cameron for depression after a stillborn child. Her husband, a sitting member of Parliament, learns of the CIA connection only through the Senate hearings. He believed his wife was receiving care at one of Canada's most respected hospitals. He had no idea the CIA was funding the program behind it. 1988. The CIA settles. No admission of wrongdoing. 1992. Canada compensates victims. No criminal charges. 2025. Families are still in court. Authorization. Experimentation. Warning. Destruction. Denial. Accidental exposure. And in that entire chain, not a single criminal conviction. What happened to the victims was documented. What happened to the evidence may be worse. The lobotomy programs I documented earlier in this series destroyed minds with surgery. In Buck versus Bell, Courts gave the state power over human bodies. Here, the same logic reached the mind. Through an intelligence budget, a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, and a university hospital where patients believed they were consenting to treatment. Sidney Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1973, the same year the files were burned. He moved to a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He raised goats. He volunteered at a hospice. He died in 1999 at 80. No charges were ever filed. Ewen Cameron died in 1967, hiking in the Adirondacks, 10 years before the program was publicly exposed. His obituary in the Canadian Medical Association Journal called him a pioneer. The record that survived is already enough. Patients entered a hospital for treatment. They were subjected to experiments they did not understand, did not consent to, and in some cases, never recovered from. Almost no one responsible was criminally punished. Sidney Gottlieb walked free. Cameron died before he could ever be held to account. Much of the evidence was destroyed before investigators could examine it. And the reason we know even this much is almost absurd. Someone left the wrong boxes in the wrong office. If the surviving record is this damning, what was in the files that never made it out? On the other side of the Iron Curtain, another intelligence service learned how to break people without drugs, without electroshock, without touching their bodies at all. They moved the furniture in your apartment while you were at work. They sent letters in your name. They told your colleagues things about you that were not true. They did not try to erase your mind. They made you doubt it yourself. And unlike the CIA, they kept every record because they were proud of what they had built. That file is next.